Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to the third day in my little Dickens Christmas Author Week. Today I'm going to be talking about Charles Dickens' Christmas book, The Cricket on the Hearth. So The Cricket on the Hearth is a Christmas book that I'm very fond of. When I first wrote this list, before I had reread the Christmas books for this year and for this series, I put The Cricket on the Hearth at number 2 as my second favourite of the Christmas novellas. I've actually decided that the one I'll be talking about tomorrow beats it, but regardless, I do love it a lot, and I think it's a really enjoyable, really lovely little Christmas story. It's not very Christmassy, however, I will tell you that. There is nothing Christmassy about The Cricket on the Hearth. It is not a Christmas story, it's not set around Christmas. I don't think it's even necessarily set around winter, but at the same time it kind of suits Christmas in the sense that it is quite warm and engaging and fun, and also sort of one of the main characters is a toy maker, which in a way just makes it feel Christmassy. It's interesting, the subtitle of The Cricket on the Hearth was A Fairy Tale of Home, and I think you can definitely see fairy tale elements in it, and also the sense to which it is very much a story about kind of domesticity and sort of praising domesticity and kind of family ties and marriage, which in many ways does kind of fit in with kind of Victorian ideas of Christmas. So I think you can see why it was published as a Christmas book, even though it isn't really set around Christmas. A Cricket on the Hearth follows the married relationship of Dot and John Perry-Bingle. They've been married probably a year and a half or so. They have a little baby. Dot is quite a lot younger than John, which is something John feels quite self-conscious of. A few things happen within the first chapter. One is that an elderly man comes to sort of lodge with them for a day or two. Another thing that happens is they're visited by a man called Mr. Tackleton, who runs a toy shop, but he's a very grumpy, not very nice man. Rather a Scrooge of the world, in fact. He is also about to marry a woman rather a lot younger than himself, and he keeps on making jokes to John about how they're similar, which rather distresses John, as John's rather a lot nicer a man than Mr. Tackleton. Working for Mr. Tackleton, there's also a man called Caleb Plummer, who is a toy maker, and he lives with his daughter, who is blind, and he lives a very poor, impoverished life. And Mr. Tackleton, who he works for, is incredibly cruel to him, but in order to protect his daughter who is blind, he pretends that their home is much bigger and much more grand and lovelier than it is, and also pretends that Mr. Tackleton is very, very nice, and pretends that everything mean he says in her presence is a joke. She is also a very skilled toy maker herself, and she makes dolls. The believability of whether or not he could hide from them the fact that they are poor, when surely she would notice in the food they eat, and she would be able to tell by walking around it the size of their house and things like that, and she'd be able to tell from the texture of the material of his coat that it's not in fact a grand coat but is really, really worn and old. But we'll leave that aside for now. It's not entirely believable. It is quite a fairy tale as it defines itself in its subtitle. This is the kind of basic setup and the actors, the characters we're working with, and things kind of go on from there. And basically in this story, John starts to believe that his wife is in love with somebody else, and it's about how he kind of deals with that and his relationship with his wife as all these things kind of come to play out. I really love The Cricket on the Hearth a lot for many reasons. One thing I love is the relationship between John and Dot and how well that is looked at, and the kind of complications of marriage in the Victorian period being something that was very often made for love, but very often made for mixed and complicated reasons that were not entirely to do with love, which could leave people in married relationships where they weren't really sure whether or not their husband or wife had married them for love or something else, which I think is really interesting to look at, the kind of way marriage worked in the Victorian period. I also really like the way this book looks very much a kind of like lower middle class life in the Victorian period. John and Dot are not wealthy. He works as a carrier. They have one maidservant who sort of helps look after the baby, but they're certainly not rich, and nor are the toy makers. Even Mr. Tackleton, although he has quite a lot of money because he is miserly like Scrooge, he certainly doesn't live sort of a grand sort of society life. Which one sort of social group I find especially interesting in the Victorian period is the kind of lower middle class, and I always find it really interesting when Dickens writes about the lower middle class, because the Victorian period really was in some ways the kind of age of the rise of the middle class. It's always interesting to look at how different sort of sections of the middle class are looked at and examined within Victorian literature. I love the exploration in this book of kind of marriage and home, the different reasons behind why people might get married, and the kind of different relationships and dynamics between husband and wife I find really interesting, and also the look at family, at the relationship between Caleb and his daughter, and the look throughout the book of kind of people trying to shield people they love, and therefore people not talking to each other. In many ways, like The Cricket on the Hearth is a book about the lack of communication and the kind of problems it can lead to, which I think is really, really interesting. In terms of things that are less strong about it, not necessarily less strong, but just that maybe not everyone will like. Like I said, it is a little bit unbelievable in places, and it does it's a little bit contrived. I still really enjoy it, and I think there are certain things that have to be overlooked. It's quite Shakespearean in many ways, with, you know, with like mistaken identity and situations that are seen and not fully understood for being what they are and things like that. There's quite a lot of little complications. In many ways, like the Battle of Life, it feels very much like a kind of Shakespearean sort of fairy tale, which I really enjoy in some ways, but I do know is probably not for everybody. Regardless, I think it's a really engaging, lovely little book by Dickens, and one that I would highly recommend. Not as Christmassy as the others certainly, but certainly a warming and comforting read for this time of year. So thank you very much for watching. Please let me know down in the comments if you've read A Cricket on the Hearth and what you thought of it, and I'll be back tomorrow to talk about another Christmas Dickens book.